Before we get into 2024, I want to talk, of course, Rick, and I'm going to come to you first, about President Biden's surprise visit to Kyiv. It was shocking for many people when they woke up this morning realizing the President of the United States was there. But there are a number of hard-right Republicans who have been really, really critical of him. Marjorie Taylor Greene, Andy Biggs, a number of people. How much influence do those Republicans have on the caucus and the Republicans who are controlling the House now?
I hope they don't have a lot, because they're wrong. What Biden did today on President's Day, and he's not of my party, but it was extraordinary. It was also historic, both from a personal risk point of view, for the risk of Ukraine, a 10-hour train ride without all the Secret Service accoutrement that he's used to having, and send a very powerful message to the world that we are standing with President Zelensky. So here on President's Day, he visits another president in another country and highlights that, and committed to a $500 million package. Because the fact is, and Marjorie Taylor Greene can answer this in a debate, I'll be happy to debate her, we either pay now with money and ammunition and weapons systems to defeat the Russians, or we will pay later with blood and treasure.
And Donna, I mean, as Rick just said, there's going to be payment for this. The president has said the United States is going to stick with Ukraine as long as possible. But can Ukraine really count on Congress, especially as Republicans are now controlling the House, to continue the support for Ukraine in the way that we've seen it?
Yeah, I think that these Republicans, and maybe there might be a couple of Democrats, are real outliers here. I think the majority of the Congress, Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, support continuing the support for Ukraine, and I think that's right. I mean, this is really a fight for democracy, and if the United States isn't going to stand on the side of Ukraine with the rest of our allies, then we're saying that we'd turn our back on democracy. And I just don't think that either Republicans or Democrats will be there. Yes, there's going to be some more scrutiny over the money and the way that it's spent. But I think that by and large, when it comes down to it, Ukraine is going to have the resources that it needs from the United States.
You know, a couple big audiences for the president when he spoke in Kiev. One was the American people, the American Congress, saying we're going to stick with Ukraine. One was our NATO allies, the worldwide coalition that has helped support Ukraine. One was Vladimir Putin, who speaks tomorrow, gives a kind of State of the Nation address, defending the invasion of Ukraine on the anniversary of it. So Biden had Putin in mind as well when he made that speech today.
And as you talk about sort of the American people being part of this calculation, I want to point out that our latest polling shows half the country believes Congress should be providing more funding and weapons to Ukraine. What do you make of that, and how important is that when you think about the support of the American people for this?
Well, it makes a difference. I mean, polling like that helps stiffen the spine of Congress when they're thinking about where they're going to cut. And of course, we hear a lot about the need for budget discipline and deficit reduction. So it matters there. But, you know, nobody should assume that kind of support continues forever, because we are with Ukraine. But there'll come a time when Americans will think we've been there long enough. This came with Afghanistan, it came with Iraq, it came with Vietnam. We are committed, and yet it's not an open-ended commitment. And that's one reason. And that's one reason I think U.S. officials are trying to think about ways. What would victory look like? How could you settle this war in a way that's acceptable to us and acceptable to Ukraine?
But I think it's all the more reason that President Biden's visit today to Ukraine was really important, because I think it continues you have to elevate this for the American people. And when that happens, then Congress is going to stand in the right place.
Well, he elevated for the American people, but as Susan said, which I think is equally as important, is it was a severe blow to Vladimir Putin, because he's supposed to explain the progress in the war, and it's very hard to explain progress in the war when the President of the United States is walking around outside in Kiev. Yeah. Really remarkable.
Well, I also want to turn, of course, to 2024. And Rick, I think it was really interesting to see Governor Larry Hogan say, if I enter this race and it becomes more crowded, I might not want to do that. And I don't want to help former President Trump, because we saw, of course, in 2016 what a crowded field meant to him. Do you think that there's a possibility that more people might think like him? And could even Ron DeSantis, running it possibly in the same lane as Donald Trump, could he dilute maybe the Trump vote?
One would think so, but remember, Michigan just elected crazy again to be there. I mean, the media would never report on a national chairman's or a state chairman's race, except that the Republican Party is going to crazy land. And you can see it in the Biden, politically speaking, Biden re-election. It's already, it's competence versus crazy. That's going to be their message. And when the Republicans keep doing crazy things and putting up crazy people, Larry Hogan sort of represents the calm, rational Republican of yesteryear, I guess. I don't want to say that because he may have a very bright future. He's perfectly capable. He won Maryland overwhelmingly, a Democratic state, and he has demonstrated you can win as a Republican. You can win with the Democrats. You can win with African Americans. And our party, the Republican Party, has got to decide that that's either their future or the minority status forever will be their future.
But that's assuming that you get to a general election. I think the problem for Larry Hogan and for other Republicans who are traveling in that lane is that there's no place for them in today's Republican Party. And I think, you know, both Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis are trying to have it both ways. They want to appeal to part of that Trump base, and then they want to appeal to the not so crazy part of the Republican Party. And unfortunately, things are like oil and water.
And Susan, it's fascinating as we think about this to also think that Ron DeSantis is out there going to blue cities, going to Staten Island, going to Chicago to talk to police unions. What do you make of those decisions? But also this ramp up, are we just going to keep seeing him ramp up until he finally announces?
Well, it's clear to me that he's running for president. I mean, it may not be clear to Ron DeSantis, but I think everyone else understands he's running for president. It's a question of what is the right timing. I mean, in some ways, Nikki Haley is out there, the first one challenging Trump. Maybe he's trying to see whether the water's fine to be a challenger to Trump this time. But Ron DeSantis is running. He has an incredible strength in Florida, which is an important state. Big double-digit re-election, but he is
an outlier in that year.
Yeah, but he is an untested national candidate,
Absolutely.
and the scrutiny you get as a presidential candidate is different than the scrutiny you get as a gubernatorial candidate.
And Rick, is there really a lane for a moderate Republican when you think about 2024? Someone like Chris Sununu who's been thinking about running.
Look, I'd like to think so, and I kind of reject the word moderate, right? Because the MAGA likes to own the conservative label. If you look at their policies, I wrote a book on this, but they are not conservatives. They're MAGA, right? Which is very different from an ideological. So I would like to, instead of moderate, I'd sort of take exception and want to use the word rational, reasonable, competent. Yes, I think there is a lane for that. And I don't think that Nikki Haley is finding it because, as you said, she talks about Donald Trump the way she talked about the Confederate flag in South Carolina for 5 years before she did anything about it. And I don't think you can have it both ways. Stand on principle and run on principle. Don't say, oh, Donald Trump is good in some way. He did a resurrection, and I'm not resurrection, an insurrection right across the street here. How is that forgivable? I don't see how it is.
Yeah. And Donna, there's this idea, of course, the Democrats, it seems like they're largely sticking to President Biden. But I wonder, do you think that there's any, might there be any regret there if President Trump isn't the nominee and you have him running against someone who might be younger, who might be seen as someone who's just really more able to do the job for longer? Of course, you know, Biden is saying, I can do this physically, mentally.
I just think at this stage, I mean, Democrats have really come to a conclusion that Joe Biden is going to be the nominee. He's the incumbent president. They are going to stand united with him and get him over whatever the hump is that some perceive that he has. And frankly, I think that Joe Biden is leading a kind of Democratic Party that is the rational party. And no matter what Republicans do, they still have that 35 whatever % of their base that is really not going in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, a lively conversation. I could talk to all of you for a long time, but that's what we'll have to do it. Thank you so much, Donna, Rick, and Susan.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.